How often do you feel overwhelmed and saturated with the work that you do, but still keep pushing ahead anyway? Are you obsessed with having a fully committed diary and feel a sense of panic if there's too much white space? Do you find that you're always in a hurry and impatient with things that take time, even if there's no pressing deadline to achieve? If you've said yes to this, you may be afflicted with the condition known as hysterical industriousness. It's a term that comes from contemporary philosophy, and it relates to our addiction to a furious pace of life. If you think about it, being busy these days is like a badge of honor. We're conditioned to believe that striving, driving, and pushing ourselves to the point of exhaustion is what makes us worthy, what makes us important, and what makes us successful. But my question is, does hysterical industriousness actually lead to better performance? Here's my story. Many years ago, I came to South Africa, as you heard, to set up an airline for Richard Branson. Now, I joined Virgin while the airline was still in its infancy and writing its policies on the back of fag packets. And I thrived in the maverick, non-bureaucratic culture that was well known for its tongue-in-cheek publicity stunts, kind of like a bit like this one, that, I'm getting confused with the slides here, a bit like this one, particularly where it meant poking fun at British Airways, Virgin's arch rival. Now, Richard was really hands-on with the airline at the time. He just sold Virgin Records to fund the expansion of the business. And so in my role, which was an account director then, regular meetings or weekly meetings with Richard were a regular occurrence for me. And my drive, high achiever, anything is possible, A-type personality got me noticed as somebody who got results. And pretty soon, my career with Virgin was literally flying. And I rose through the ranks to join a rotating pool of senior managers that went around the world setting up and running airlines in different countries. And hysterical industriousness was a perfect mood for this role, because this was Virgin. There were no rules, there were no policies, there were no how-to manuals. You learned to fly by the seat of your pants. And that's how I love to work. I was addicted to adventure. I was addicted to being busy. And anything less than 150% simply wasn't enough. So it wasn't unusual to find me arriving early, leaving late, pulling all-nighters and working weekends just so that I could stay ahead of my game. But not because Richard or anybody at Virgin said, this is what you've got to do, Caroline, but because there was this little nagging anxiety that said, if you don't keep pushing, you're going to fall behind, or worse still, you're going to fail. And when Richard declared Virgin's launch in South Africa as one of the most successful in Virgin's history, and I began to get the reputation in the South African travel industry as a bit of a visionary kick-ass leader who was changing the way that the airline did business in the country, or the airlines did business in the country, I pushed myself even harder. And I didn't think very much of it. You know, this was the way that I had to work. And because the airline was going from strength to strength, and because the flights were full, it didn't seem to matter. Until one day, I had a very public meltdown in front of Richard and hundreds of high-profile guests at a launch event in Cape Town, the second launch event in Cape Town. Now, I don't know how many of you have been afflicted with stage 4 burnout in your life, but for those of you that haven't, it's a little bit more than another bad day at the office. It's a state of complete mental, emotional, and physical exhaustion, where despite the 1,000 volts of electricity that are coursing through your veins from a nervous system that is in overdrive and adrenal glands that are on the verge of collapse, you feel like a burnt-out, empty, hollow shell. And rest and sleep are impossible, because the system is so wired that you just actually cannot switch off. And recovery can take years. It took me years to recover from this. But sadly, recovery doesn't always happen. Because in stage 4 burnout, that can end in death, from cardiovascular collapse and even stroke, and sadly even suicide. Because in stage 4 burnout, you are afflicted with feeling absolutely hopeless and caught in a state of depression and despair and believing that you are indeed a complete and utter failure. And burnout is real. In a recent international survey, 67% of employees said that they were exhausted or burnt out by the work that they did, or the environment that they worked in. 72% of senior managers said the same thing. And of that 72%, 71% said they'd been burnt out more than once. And the cost of burnout in the States alone is $190 billion a year, and that is a conservative estimate. So are we all mad? Because here's the kicker. There's absolutely no evidence that pushing ourselves to breaking point leads to better productivity, better performance, better levels of engagement. In fact, it makes it worse. So what's the solution? Are we all broken? Do we need fixing? And what do organisations need to do about something which is clearly becoming quite a big issue? Here's what I learned. Organisations are simply not willing or not ready to deal with the overwhelmed and oversaturated employee. And even if they were, the solution doesn't lie in neatly packaged 10-point performance improvement plans. The solution lies with us. You see, hysterical industriousness is an addiction, which has become hardwired into our biology. And given that the speed of change and the pace of life has reached such epidemic proportions, it's no longer a sustainable performance option. It's no longer enough to apply work-life balance and stress management techniques, because how well are we doing at that anyway? To sustain performance into the longer term, we need to totally rethink the way that we operate. So if you're one of the 72% in the audience that's burnt out, know this. You're not broken. You don't need fixing. We just need to learn to make different choices, and that means learning to recalibrate as we go along. And that's what this talk is about, or my keynote is about. So in the Madness of High Performance, I talk about an acronym. I use the acronym of MAD to take people on a journey to help dispel some of the myths that we have about being a high performer while getting to the heart of what it means to be human in a crazy world. In the Masks of Authenticity, I talk about how, as a high achiever, I was so engaged with the work that I did and so addicted to to being busy and so identified with this Virgin brand and culture and this superwoman bull-busting persona that I created for myself, that I was like a stick of rock with Virgin stamped through it. I didn't know where I started and Virgin stopped. God, it's pathetic when I think about it. And the reason that I kept myself so hysterically busy was so I didn't have to look at myself or the chaos that I was creating around me. And so what burnout taught me was that it doesn't matter what your title is, doesn't matter how much power and authority you wield, how much you own or the letters after your name. Unless you have an authentic relationship with yourself, burnout, or worse, is inevitable. You see, this whole performance thing is a double-edged sword. It's easy to get all puffed up and look at me and how wonderful I am, and isn't this great, I've got Richard Branson's home phone number and all that kind of thing. But it's got to be balanced with something else. And that's particularly important for leaders, because leaders, by definition, have followers. So as a leader, what makes you somebody that other people want to follow? I couldn't answer that question. So in the Masks of Authenticity, we look at what does it really mean to be authentic? Why is it important? And how resolving a number of inner conflicts can help us sustain performance into the longer term. In the Anatomy of Experience, I start this section of the talk with a story, a Sufi parable that tells the tale of an old man who's walking home one night when he sees a friend on his hands and knees searching for something under a streetlight. So he goes to his friend and he says, "Well, what are you looking for?" And his friend tells him that he's dropped a key somewhere. So the old man agrees to help. And after a few minutes of frustrated searching and still finding no key, the old man says to his friend, "Well, where were you when you dropped the key in the first place?" And his friend stands up and points to a place a few meters away in the shadows. "Over there," he says. So the old man's a little perplexed. So, "Well, why are we searching here then?" "Because," came the reply, "this is where the light is." And I think we do the same with performance. we look for the keys to performance in all the light spaces, in all the obvious places, typically about changing behavior. We look at ways to change our behavior. So we set goals, we deploy time management techniques, we put plans and strategies in place, thinking that just by doing that, we're going to get a different result. But what we're really only doing is touching the tip of the iceberg, because we're not looking in the dark and unfamiliar places, which is where the keys to performance lie all along. Neuroscience now is telling us that we become stupid under pressure, that the logical, rational thinking part of our brain kind of disintegrates and doesn't operate when we're under the whip. Instead, it relies on information from past experience and uses that instead. And so we might think that we're making logical, rational decisions, but technically 99% of our behavior is driven by habitual, biochemical or emotional responses that are stored in the brain's memory banks and in the body's nervous system. And depending on how those emotions conform to what it is that we want to do will depend on whether we actually can sustain performance and have the power and energy to sustain performance in the long term. I spent most of my career thinking that I could outthink my anxiety, my perfectionism, my resentment, and all my other performance foibles, and kind of neatly package them into a little box, because emotions, moods, and feelings had no role in logical, rational business. Well, that worked, didn't it? Look at where it got me. That didn't work. And so recalibrating involves making different conscious choices. And rethinking about things as we go along. And we can't do that if we're ignorant about the role that emotions play. And we can't do that if we're ignorant about the way that we function as biological beings. So in the anatomy of experience, what I talk about is some of the core drivers behind hysterical industriousness and how they underpin absolutely everything about performance, including the way that we relate to change, the way that we deal with the uncertainty of the future, and whether or not we achieve our potential. And finally, in the dance of performance, I liken performance to a form of art. Performance is a skill. It's something that we learn, and it takes time to find our own natural performance rhythm. For me, I believed, or was conditioned to believe, that striving, driving, and pushing myself to the absolute limit was the only way to survive. So it was a revelation to me to realize there's actually a middle point, something that we can get to where we can make better conscious choices, where our performance can be sustained, and we actually work better as a result. So in the dance of performance, what I do is I talk about some small shifts that can make a big difference and help us to recalibrate as we go along. Richard Branson was known for saying, "Screw business as usual." And I think that in our 24/7, always-on Western culture, we've got to say, screw performance as usual and begin performance unusual. I'm Caroline Ravenall. Thank you very much.